our first story for today comes from Dark Reading, and the title here is 0 Days Win the Prize for Most Exploited Bones. So CISA, the cybersecurity, and I still hate this name. I remain hopeful that someday somebody will fix this abomination, this injustice on the world of calling it the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Like, I just think that it's just wrong. Anyway.
Is it like calling it like an ATM machine?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. It hurts. It hurts. Like, it actually hurts me to say it. So anyway, CISA, I'm going to call them CISA because I don't like the full name, released a report. They do good work, by the way. And so it's not a slight on them. It's a slight on their name. And whoever came up with the name should feel bad. But now if I'm done now and we can move on. They released this report, which enumerates, they've done this for several years now, basically the top exploited vulnerabilities. And I will say, I do want to take just a slight diversion. If you rewind a while ago, CISA started this KEV, it's the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities List. And for a long time, I would characterize it as a bit of a joke. Like, things would be exploited for a very long time, and then somebody would wake up over there, and then they would add it to the vulnerability list. And the intention there is, by the way, that when something gets added to that list, a government agency, U.S. government agencies, and others that may be acting on behalf of the government have to take swift action to remediate those vulnerabilities. Like, they have a hard time.
Right.
You don't get out of fixing them. You have to fix them. Full stop. But over the past, I would say 2 or 3 years, that has transformed into something that is actually really useful. Like, they are very timely. They're updating it on a timely basis. And I think it's become something of a reliable resource. And so I want to give them kudos. I don't know what changed. I don't know why it changed. Something changed, and I think it's awesome. So
no, it's good. I completely agree, by the way. I hate to be so snarky about it, but it was like, you'd hear from the government news that I found out about on open source a month ago, right? It was like did you ever get involved with any of the FBI driven like ISACs and such that were like, privileged information? I'm like, I just read about this on Dark Reading a month ago. It's not that privileged. It was so slow. And I think that's just some of the inherent problems with government, right? They have so much red tape and that they can't move at the speed that we want to move at. So yeah, you're right. Something must have changed, and I'm happy for it. And frankly, I do find it helpful. I think we saw some other stats just came out in the last week or two that the amount of new CVEs versus exploit activity witnessed and categorized in CVEs is something like 0.5% of the actual CVEs were truly known to have been exploited. So that's like this huge gulf of like, which one should I patch? And, in patching everything, by the way, I'm just going to state for the record, is not always a viable option. Like, I need to prioritize somehow. So having some sort of, and I'm seeing tools build in awareness and alerting around the KEV, which is helpful. And it allows me to sort of give better risk-based guidance on what to work on. But back to our article today, what's really interesting is we kind of have operated under the assumption that most threat actors don't want to burn 0 days. They want to keep them for the most juicy targets, the most interesting targets. This article kind of flies in the face of that.
Yeah, their reporting here shows that in 2023, over half of exploited vulnerabilities started off being exploited as 0 days, which is quite interesting. So, basically that means that the majority of exploit activity is happening against vulnerabilities that do not have a patch yet,
which is a problem.
Yes,
it makes it more difficult.
Yeah, and so they enumerate a couple of different strategies. One from the perspective of software producers, and one from the perspective of consumers. And certainly from, I would say that a lot of the work I'm seeing the U.S. government do recently is in the space of producers, right? They're trying to drive discipline around software lifecycle management, software development lifecycle, and memory safe languages and lots of other adjacent processes. But not all of us are in the business of creating software. A lot of us are in the in the seat of having to deal with the impacts of software that other companies write that we're more or less forced to operate, which in turn has these 0-day vulnerabilities. One thing that I found particularly interesting, because they do enumerate like the top, I think it was the top 15 vulnerabilities that they saw exploited as 0 days. Out of the 15, 6 of them were what I would call like core network infrastructure stuff, like from Cisco and Citrix and Fortinet. There were some from Progress. Certainly Move It software was there, Atlassian, Apache. But there's a lot of things I would say are typically expected to be on your edge that were part
Right.
of this group of systems that were exploited, and that kind of flies in the face of, well, like, just don't expose it to the internet. Like, that starts to break down when in fact the problem is with something that you're intentionally buying to put on the edge to protect your other stuff, and then it ends up being the way that people get in.
Well, yeah, I had a very similar thought, but then I was thinking, okay, is this a statistical bias situation where if I'm doing a good job of isolating everything else, the only thing I'm exposing are these tools that are meant to be exposed, so therefore they're getting more
Sure.
rigor and more attention? I don't know. I don't think that's true. Actually, I think we're just in this weird cycle where these tools that are on the edge have gotten weak and more easily attacked. But it's tough to know. Like, statistics are so tricky of this game theory going on of what's exposed versus not exposed versus, development lifecycle versus what's reported versus what's kind of. It's so tough to know. But I think nonetheless, what this tells me is somehow think about and game out what happens if that perimeter device that you have to have exposed gets hacked.
Yes.
And how do you mitigate that, right? Whether it's through more segmentation, through more monitoring, through less trust inherently between your devices, and forcing still traffic to be authenticated, even with assumption of a bad actor sitting on that perimeter device. Okay, how do I still authenticate that traffic? I mean, every environment's a little different, but that's the kind of stuff I think about in light of this news.
Yeah, definitely. I would also say, I, I I know every one of these is a little bit different story, but there are several which are the vulnerabilities are in components that don't necessarily need to be exposed to the internet. So while, for
Mm-hmm.
example, your Cisco firewall is, it's intended to be on the edge, the management console for it doesn't need to be. And I think, like with, I think it was Fortinet, and I apologize if I'm wrong on this, but I think it's Fortinet. Like, the default is that its management console is internet facing, and you actually have to take
Right.
like steps to change that. And so um I think there's also kind of a least privilege, and I don't necessarily mean that in like an IAM stance, but like if you don't, yeah, I think you need to take a very close look at how your devices, especially on the edge, are configured to make sure that
Mm-hmm.
you're minimally exposing things, because it does seem like, in one of the recent shows we did, we were making fun of one of the providers was using PHP in their management console. Well, like, you don't have to have that exposed to the internet. We can make fun of it all the time, but like, that shouldn't be exposed. I think
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't really intended to be exposed. And I will also say that, back to your point about how to think about this, I think one of the, if you go back a couple of years, I think there was a kind of a a moment, a pause in the industry caused by some researcher finding a serious vulnerability in one of these firewalls.
Yeah.
And I think that caused a lot of both, the bad guys and the good guys to start investigating these firewalls, which I don't think had really had any like substantial focus by the security industry. Like it was just kind of not on everybody's radar, and something happened. And as we see all the time, once one thing happens, like there's this mad rush, to go look for other things. When we saw Log4j, like, there was the initial Log4j vulnerability, and then there was just this freight train of more vulnerabilities that kept getting found. And I think we see that, quite often. And I definitely think that was the case with this, and is going to continue to be the case, because I really feel like security vendors are some of the worst offenders at writing secure software. And I
Having
can
worked
say
at a
that,
few,
yes.
yeah, I think we've both worked at a few, and I think it's absolutely true, which is fascinating because part of their entire reputation is based on trust and security. And but I agree with you, by the way. You've made this point over the years, and I certainly don't disagree that when the research community or the bad guy community gets a hint of one class of problem, they then take that and replicate that investigation or that class of problem proof of concept across many, many, many different environments that they might not have tried before. It gives them a new template to test against, basically, or to look at. And speaking of Log4j, just randomly, it's funny, we still see attempts all day long against our web properties with Log4j in my current environments all the time. So it's still hanging around.
I think we're going to see Log4j. I strongly suspect there are still actively sold things that have vulnerable versions of Log4j, just because we have such limited visibility into what gets incorporated into software. And I mean, I think it's not everywhere. Like I think the industry has done a pretty good job of eradicating it, but like I'm quite certain it's still there some places.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So one of the other findings of this report was that the usefulness of exploiting a vulnerability tapers off from the perspective of an attacker after about 2 years. And I think that's because after about 2 years, there's a majority of the landscape has either, sunset the technology or has applied the patch or what have you. But I found it interesting that, we've talked a lot in recent episodes about the importance of patching and how, like, as an industry, we don't do a great job of that because it's not very sexy, and like we're struggling with labor shortages, or it's not the right way to say it, right? But we don't have enough people to do everything that needs to be done, and patching tends to fall off the side because like everybody wants to play with the new AI enabled, whatever, and so that's just something that it takes a back seat. But here we're saying, like, even if you're doing a great job of patching, it may not be enough, and so you really need to also be focusing on mitigating controls, looking, your ability, as you pointed out, to quickly detect that something was exploited and bypassed, or secondary controls, looking at things that are on the edge, and how how do you mitigate an exploit of that from resulting in deeper penetration into your network. So these are certainly difficult times. As we'll talk about a little bit later, like there's a lot of opportunity for adversaries. Like this is the world is getting more dangerous, not less dangerous. And I think it's becoming more important that we pay attention to these mitigating controls.
Yep. Especially when you take into consideration, even for those that have a patch before an exploit appears, we're seeing that window shrink so rapidly that it's almost becoming impossible to patch fast enough.
Right.
And then, there's risks with patching. We see this all the time. If you patch too fast, you could introduce a production outage or a production issue. So I'm not saying patching is important. I think it's absolutely foundational, especially because we're not even talking about a lateral movement or privilege escalation or any sort of inside, once somebody's inside, how they might move around, which matters, right? You can't just focus on the edge. But what I think this is telling us is that we need to also build our defenses with the assumption that we haven't been able to patch a problem before it's exploited in some way. And how do we know and detect that?
Right. Yep. Absolutely.